In this video, we're covering 3 main reasons volunteers quit. Let's do this.
Hi, we are Ted and Lisa Snyder. We are nonprofit consultants because we believe a better world needs healthier nonprofits. And today we are talking about the reasons that volunteers too often quit teams. And this is something that we want you to see what's happening and be able to make changes, because if you can spend less time recruiting and more time actually changing the world, everything would get so much better and your life would be a lot easier, simply because you'd be able to focus on growing into the future versus just trying to scramble to get enough people on board today.
Right. I think a lot of focus is too often put into recruiting new volunteers. That's important, but retaining volunteers is a much better way to make sure that your nonprofit is growing, because if you're retaining them, that means you're not having to spend as much time training new volunteers and do all that stuff too. So retaining your volunteers, hugely important. So let's talk about the 3 main reasons why they are quitting your team. Hopefully these aren't reasons why they're quitting your team, but
maybe you have a leader underneath you and you notice that some volunteers are falling off.
Yeah, no, it's not your fault. Definitely not.
First one is frustrating leadership. This is incredibly difficult for volunteers to say, because a lot of times when a volunteer is considering being done with the team, often it's because they are frustrated. And when they're frustrated at leadership, they have a hard time expressing it, because no one wants to be the person who goes to their leader and says, I'm frustrated at you, or I have a problem with you for these reasons. And a lot of times it's not because the leaders are bad or terrible, but more just that they might have quirks or they might not realize what they're doing and their volunteers are getting frustrated.
Right. In the nonprofit world, it can be especially messy, because by the time that people are frustrated enough to leave, they're not yet frustrated enough necessarily to speak their mind. Yeah. In a business setting, they might go to the boss and be like, I quit. I'm sick and tired. I've had it up to here, because they put up with it so long because they're getting paid. They're being compensated for their time, really. Yeah. In the volunteer nonprofit world, if they're like, you know what, I just don't like this, they'll just start ghosting you. They just won't show up. They'll show up late. They'll not really try.
Yeah, and the amount of leverage that you have isn't really there. If you're trying to use for-profit leverage in a nonprofit sector, volunteers are going to be like, I just don't have to answer your phone call. I just don't have to show up. If you're not bringing me the value that I think, then I just won't come. Now, frustration looks different depending on the person. So here's a few ways that frustration can happen, or what it might look like. And part of this is you have to understand your volunteers enough to know which of these might be impacting them depending on their personalities.
So first of all is incompetence. If you are trying to lead volunteers to do something that they know better than you, and you are just actually incompetent at telling them what to do, they're going to be so frustrated. They're going to be like, I'm done.
And incompetence mixed with micromanaging, terrible.
Yeah, really, really bad.
The next big one is disorganization. If you're just disorganized and you don't have a schedule for when they're coming in or when they're showing up, you don't have ready for them to do what they're going to be doing, or they feel like being a part of this organization is actually adding chaos to their own lives, because maybe you live a chaotic life and it's kind of spilling over into their personal lives or their ability to volunteer, their time frame. They don't know when they're showing up, and when they do show up, they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. And at the end of the day, they can't even tell if they made a difference. That's a huge frustration for volunteers.
And another reason why frustrating leadership can rear its ugly head is just because of inconsistency in what you bring to the table as a leader. Yeah. We actually have a full podcast episode that we're going to be doing soon about this concept, but just the idea that if you have a bad day as a leader, guess what? You don't have that luxury of showing up and treating people differently because you had a bad day. In the volunteer world, you bring the consistency, you set the temperature. You're the one who, like, when you walk into the room, people know, like, hey, this is going to be great because they're here. And if you're up and down and they don't know what they're going to get, when that consistency goes out the window, guess what? They go out the window too. They're done.
Yep, absolutely. And then the last one here I'd say is when you are not aware as a leader. A lot of times the frustration probably has been brought up. There's probably been times where your volunteers are begging you to get your stuff together. But you're just aware. Maybe you need to grow in your emotional intelligence, your social intelligence, listening a little bit more. Sometimes it might be that they actually are frustrated and they're bringing it up. And part of what they're frustrated about is they're like, I am doing the hard work of communicating, and they are so busy, they can't even listen to what I'm saying and hear me. And so if your volunteers are starting to express any of those things, know that the amount that they're expressing to you, it's probably a lot bigger in their mind. And they're trying to bring it up before it hits a boiling point where they can't be a part of your team anymore. Volunteers who bring stuff up, chances are they want to stay a part of your team. If they didn't want to, they wouldn't tell you what was bothering them.
Yeah, they'd be out before they had a chance to tell you.
Yes.
All right. Second reason volunteers quit. So we just covered the first one, frustrating leadership. It's a big one. The second reason most volunteers quit is because they're being pressured to volunteer more than what they're ready to commit to.
This is like being in one of those sales pitches where you're like, I just want to buy this one little thing. And they're like, well, since you bought that one thing, now you're on an email list for the rest of your life. And we're going to be calling you. And I'm going to keep you here and try and get you to buy 4 more things because I already have you as a customer. So I'm going to try and get you to do more. This happens all the time within volunteering. A team will get a new volunteer and the volunteer's like, I want to volunteer 2 hours every other week. And I want to do this small task. And that volunteer will be in to do this little task that they feel comfortable with. And pretty soon it's like, hey, could you stay for an extra half hour and help with the side project? Hey, instead of every other week, could you come in every week? And instead of 2 hours, we'll do 1.5 hours. And it's kind of a little bit more, but it won't feel like too much. Or you're really great on this one team helping out with admin over here. Could you also just kind of do a little bit of admin work for this unrelated team? And since you're doing that, could you also just clean up the room after you're done and tidy it up? Because our other people who aren't admin are kind of messy. Like there's so much pressure and we don't even realize that leaders do it to volunteers sometimes.
Yeah, and it can be to an extreme or it can just be a subtle thing like, hey, I know you were just in last week doing your normal thing. I know you come in every other week, but the person who was going to come in this week can't. So can you just come in and fill it in? Like, do not make those kind of requests of people until you've been able to have a conversation with them about how much they want to increase what they're doing. Because you can increase what volunteers are doing. You just have to like hold their hand and like partner with them in it. You can't just like spring it on them and guilt them into it.
Right. A lot of times there's this fear of if I ask a volunteer to change what they're doing, they might choose to opt out altogether. And so what leaders will do instead is kind of force these opportunities where that volunteer can get involved. And we justify it, or it's justified by saying, well, if they didn't want to, they would have said no. And that's not a fair position to put the volunteer in. And so when they feel pressured into volunteering more, or there's this assumed, your time was from 12 to 2, but we moved it from 11 to 1. And then they're in. It's like, well, technically you were available for 2. So can you stay till 2? So can you stay for a little bit more? Those little things that a lot of times leaders don't even recognize as pressure puts an immense amount of pressure on volunteers. And when they start to feel that too much, not only will they opt out, but your organization and you as a leader will get the reputation of don't say yes, because if you give them an inch, they will take a mile. And people in your community will start to learn that about you.
Yep.
And it'll become harder to get more in the future.
And when it comes to the legacy flywheel, which you talk about all the time, it degrades the trust. Remember, everything that you do in your organization, you want to be constantly building trust. And when you promise this is a 2-hour commitment and you go even 2 hours and 2.5 hours, that's enough to degrade trust. So just don't do it. Like it's much better to just hold true to what you do. That means you got to do a better job of planning how much time it's going to actually take, how much effort it's going to take, and do a good job explaining that to people when they show up to volunteer or before they even commit.
And then if you realize you explained it wrong, that is not up to your volunteer to make up that difference. That is up to you to figure it out. And there's a little bit of figure it out. Third reason that volunteers quit, the leadership doesn't prioritize them. As a nonprofit leader, I'm sure you value your volunteers, but there is a difference between understanding that volunteers have value and truly prioritizing them when everything nonprofit is screaming your name and wanting you to go a million different directions. We say nonprofit work is like a black hole. There's always another need. There's always another call you can make. There's always one more person you could care for. And sometimes in the midst of so many things going on, we forget to prioritize the people who have raised their hands and said, I want to partner with you so that you can become more effective.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. Like when you don't prioritize them when it comes to what they are expecting from the volunteer role, they feel that. They really, really feel that. You cannot just assume that, oh, it'll just blow over. This is a very real thing that they are going to take home with them at the end of volunteering when they feel like they didn't get their questions answered or enough attention. There's a certain amount where you do want to make sure that you let them, do it on their own. That's part of prioritizing them sometimes, is leaving them alone so they can do it.
Yeah.
You don't want to micromanage. But if you're completely hanging them out to dry and they feel like a kid in the pool that you just threw in without a life jacket, like that happens a ton in the volunteer world.
Yeah. A lot of times we talk about people falling through the cracks in recruiting, but people can fall through the cracks in every area. And this is one of the biggest retention issues, is when someone has already been volunteering for a while. And maybe it's that out of everything that you need right now, what they have to offer isn't filling one of those like key things in your brain. When you just don't call them to even get them in at all, you're telling them, we don't need your hours, we don't need your time, we don't need your skills, and we do not need you. And that is a really hard thing for people to swallow. And I've been in situations where I've talked to volunteers of other organizations, and they'll say, I wanted to volunteer there. I raised my hand. I offered the time. I went through their training. No one ever called me. And at that point, even if that organization called them, that person has been so hurt personally that they have opted out and just said, I don't know if I can put myself out there again with this organization, because they don't want to feel rejected.
Yeah, they quit before they even started.
Yeah, they quit before they started, and it's really hard to get them. So if you're in a position where you're realizing, I have some awesome volunteers and I haven't prioritized them properly, go apologize to them. And not in a way of, I'm sorry if I possibly made you feel like what you were doing didn't matter, but I'm sorry that I did not set you up for success and I did not call you. Not I'm sorry if I made you feel a certain, no, I'm just sorry because I messed up. If you're willing to do that, you will have a way better chance of retaining some of those people who might be on the verge of falling through the cracks. And, you can still restore a lot of those relationships if you're willing to take that first step as the leader.
Right. So you're watching this video. Hopefully you've gotten some really good ideas on how to retain volunteers. But if you're thinking, hey, I could just use some more volunteers as well, we have a video that could help you out a ton. We have 4 tips for getting new volunteers. That video is on the screen right now, and we'll see you guys over there.